My snobby mill told me I wasn't good enough for her daughter, so I took her husband. Mrs. Freeman had barely let me finish introducing myself before launching into questions about my salary, my car, and whether I planned to buy a house before proposing to her daughter. A marketing coordinator, she said, wrinkling her nose like I'd said professional gooner. And you've been at this position for how long? 2 years? Most ambitious young men would have been promoted by now. Calin squeezed my hand under the table while her father, Mr. Freeman, just quietly ate his pot roast. He hadn't said more than hello since I'd arrived at their massive house. Every time his wife made another cutting remark about my career or my apartment or my Toyota Camry, he'd just take another sip of wine. The interrogation continued through the main course. Mrs. Freeman wanted to know about my family, specifically what my parents did for a living. When I mentioned my dad was a plumber and my mom taught kindergarten, she actually laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a harsh bark that made Calin flinch beside me. Well, I suppose someone has to do those jobs, she said, cutting her meat with precise movements. Though I'd hoped Calin would find someone more established. She went to Yale, you know. We have certain expectations. I tried to defend myself by mentioning my Columbia College degree and my plans to start my own marketing firm someday. But Mrs. Freeman waved her hand dismissively and started listing all of Calin's ex-boyfriends who were now doctors and lawyers. One apparently just made partner at a prestigious firm. Another was doing surgery at Johns Hopkins. Mom, please stop, Calin finally said, her voice small. I'm just making conversation, darling. If he can't handle a simple dinner discussion, how will he handle the pressures of marriage? Mr. Freeman cleared his throat and excused himself to get another bottle of wine. When he returned, I noticed his hands shaking slightly as he poured. His wife didn't seem to notice, too busy explaining why she thought I should consider going back to school for a real career. By dessert, I was ready to leave and never come back, but I couldn't. Mrs. Freeman had criticized everything from my haircut to my watch to the way I held my fork. She kept mentioning how disappointed she was that Calin had settled after all the opportunities they'd given her. Calin looked close to tears. When dinner finally ended, I helped clear the table just to escape the dining room. Mr. Freeman followed me to the kitchen and quietly asked if I wanted to step outside for some beers. We went out to the back patio where he had a small cooler of beers. He handed me one and said, "Don't let her get to you," he finally said. "She's like that with everyone." I took a long drink before responding. "Does she treat all of Calin's boyfriends like that?" He nodded slowly. "Every single one. Been doing it for years. She has this image in her head of what Calin's life should look like and nobody ever measures up. For what it's worth," he continued, "I think you're good for Calin. She's happier than I've seen her in years. You have my blessing. Not that you need it." I thanked him for the support and for the beer. He smiled and told me, "You remind me of someone I knew a long time ago," he said softly. "Before I met Margaret. Before everything got so complicated. We talked for another 20 minutes about safer topics like football, but I kept noticing the way he looked at me, like he was seeing someone else. When I laughed at one of his jokes, he stepped closer and leaned in and kissed me. Not a friendly peck, but a real kiss that lasted several seconds before he pulled back. I stood frozen in shock, and he looked horrified at what he'd done. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "You just remind me so much of my old boyfriend, before my wife buried his body back here." The words hung in the air between us while I stood there unable to move or speak or even breathe properly. Mr. Freeman's face went from red to white in about 2 seconds as he realized what he'd just said out loud. He stumbled backward and knocked over his beer bottle, which shattered on the concrete patio. His hands flew up to cover his mouth and tears started running down his face. He grabbed my shoulders hard enough to hurt and started shaking me while whispering that I had to forget everything. His breath smelled like wine and beer mixed together, and his fingers dug into my arms. He kept saying Margaret would kill us both if she found out he'd told anyone about what happened. His whole body shook, and more tears came as he begged me to promise I wouldn't say anything to Calin. The back door creaked open and we both jumped apart like we'd been caught doing something wrong. Calin stepped out onto the patio looking confused about why we were standing so far apart. She asked if everything was okay since we'd been outside for almost 40 minutes. I forced my mouth into what I hoped looked like a normal smile and told her we'd just been talking about work stuff and the marketing industry. Mr. Freeman wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and mumbled something about his allergies acting up from all the pollen. He walked past both of us and went inside without looking at either of us. Calin watched him go with a worried look on her face, then turned back to me. She said her mom wanted to say goodbye before we left for the night. My stomach felt like it dropped through the floor at the thought of facing Margaret now that I knew what she'd done. We went back inside where Mrs. Freeman was waiting in the living room with her arms crossed. She looked me up and down one more time with that same disgusted expression from dinner. She told Calin she hoped I would rise to meet expectations before our next visit. The way she said it made it sound more like a threat than encouragement. I managed to thank her for dinner, even though my brain kept screaming about the body buried in her backyard. Mr. Freeman had disappeared somewhere in the house and didn't come out to say goodbye. Calin grabbed her purse and we finally escaped to my car parked in their long driveway. During the drive home, Calin kept apologizing for how her mother had treated me at dinner. She said her dad had seemed to really like me, though, which was unusual for him. That comment made me feel sick to my stomach knowing what had just happened on the patio. I told her I needed to stop for gas even though my tank was still half full. She didn't question it and just nodded while looking out the window. At the gas station, I went inside and locked myself in the single bathroom stall. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and texted Isabelle that something completely insane had just happened. She called me back within 10 seconds and I answered in a whisper. I told her everything about the kiss and the confession about the buried body. She stayed quiet for a few seconds, then told me I needed to document everything right away with exact times. She said I should write down every single detail while it was still fresh in my memory. She also warned me to never be alone with either of Calin's parents again for my own safety. She asked if I was going to call the police, but I didn't know what to do yet. She said I needed to decide fast whether to report it or try to get more information first. I thanked her and hung up, then splashed cold water on my face before going back outside. Calin was still in the car scrolling through her phone when I got back. She looked up and asked if I was feeling okay because I looked really pale. I blamed it on her mother's interrogation at dinner, making me feel stressed and overwhelmed. She reached over and squeezed my hand while saying she understood completely. She had no idea that her father had just confessed to helping cover up a murder. The rest of the drive to my apartment was quiet, except for the radio playing softly. Calin fell asleep around 11 that night after we watched some TV together. I waited another 30 minutes to make sure she was really out, then crept to the bathroom with my laptop. I sat on the closed toilet lid and started searching for missing persons cases from 20 to 30 years ago. The local newspaper archives were all online now, which made it easier to search. I found 3 possible matches for young men who had disappeared around the time Mr. Freeman would have been in his 20s. One was a medical student named James who vanished without a trace in 1993. Another was a bartender who never showed up for work one day in 1994. The third was a construction worker reported missing by his roommate in 1992. All 3 were described as being in their 20s with dark hair like Mr. Freeman had mentioned about his old boyfriend. I took screenshots of all the articles and saved them in a folder on my desktop. My mind kept racing with questions about which one might be buried under those flowers. I closed my laptop and crept back to bed where Calin was still sleeping peacefully, with no idea what her dad had told me. My brain wouldn't shut off and I kept seeing those missing persons photos every time I closed my eyes. The clock showed 3 in the morning, and I knew I wouldn't be getting any real sleep tonight. I laid there staring at the ceiling fan going around and around while my stomach twisted into knots thinking about tomorrow's Sunday brunch. There was no way I could sit at that table with Mrs. Freeman knowing what I knew now about the body in her backyard. When the sun finally came up around 6:30, I was still wide awake and felt like I'd been hit by a truck. Calin stretched and rolled over to kiss me good morning, but stopped when she saw my face. She asked if I was feeling okay because I looked really tired and maybe even a little sick. I grabbed my phone and pretended to check my work email while telling her I'd gotten an urgent message about a client crisis. The lie came out easier than I expected, as I explained that I needed to go into the office to handle some emergency presentations. She actually looked relieved and said maybe we should skip brunch with her parents since I had work stuff to deal with. I felt guilty lying to her, but also grateful for the excuse to avoid seeing her parents again so soon. She got up and started getting ready for her yoga class while I made coffee and tried to act normal. My hands shook a little as I poured the coffee, and she noticed but didn't say anything about it. After she kissed me goodbye and left for yoga, I waited about 10 minutes before grabbing my car keys. I needed to see the Freeman house in daylight and check if anything looked different after last night's confession. The drive over there took about 20 minutes and my heart was pounding the whole time. I parked down the street and walked past slowly like I was just out for a morning walk. The backyard was visible from the sidewalk if you looked at the right angle between the houses. Fresh mulch had been spread around all the hydrangea bushes, and it looked like someone had been working in the garden recently. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and took a few quick photos of the backyard. The oldest hydrangea bush was huge and had probably been there for decades based on its size. I wondered if James was really buried under all those roots and flowers that Mrs. Freeman probably tended every weekend. A neighbor came out to get their newspaper and looked at me funny, so I kept walking around the block. When I got back to my car, I texted Isabelle asking if she could meet me for coffee as soon as possible. She replied right away saying she could meet at the coffee shop near our office in 30 minutes. I drove there trying to calm down and figure out what exactly I was going to tell her. The coffee shop was mostly empty on Sunday morning, except for a few people working on laptops. Isabelle was already there with 2 coffees waiting, and she could tell something was wrong immediately. I sat down and started telling her every single detail from the night before while she took notes on her phone. She made me go through it 3 times to make sure we had all the facts straight and documented. Her face got more and more worried as I described Mr. Freeman's kiss and his confession about the body. She said we needed to think carefully about what to do next, because this could destroy my relationship with Calin. Part of her thought I should make an anonymous tip to the police, but she worried about how it would affect everything. We spent another hour going over all the details, and she helped me write everything down with exact times. My phone buzzed and I saw a text from Mr. Freeman that made my stomach drop all over again. He was apologizing for his inappropriate behavior last night and blamed drinking too much wine for making him emotional. The text said he hoped I could forget what happened and promised it would never happen again. I showed it to Isabelle and she told me not to respond but to save the message as evidence. About an hour later, my phone rang, and it was Mrs. Freeman's number showing on the screen. I let it go to voicemail at first, but she called right back, so I answered on the second ring. Her voice was cold and formal as she informed me about a garden party they were having next weekend. She said she expected Calin and me to attend and help show a united family front to their friends. The way she said it made it clear this wasn't really an invitation, but more like a direct order. I mumbled something about checking my schedule, and she cut me off saying she was sure I could make time. After she hung up, I felt sick thinking about having to go back to that house and pretend everything was normal. When I got home later, Calin was back from yoga and making lunch in the kitchen. I knew I had to say something about her parents, but didn't know how to start the conversation. Finally, I just told her I wasn't comfortable around her parents and thought we should take a break from family events. She immediately got defensive and said I was being dramatic about her mother's personality quirks. She said I needed to try harder to fit in with her family if our relationship was going to work. We ended up having our first real argument with her defending her parents, and me trying not to reveal what I knew. 2 days passed with things still tense between us, and I couldn't stop thinking about the body in the backyard. I finally decided to call in an anonymous tip from a payphone at the mall during my lunch break. I gave the police just the address and said there might be human remains buried in the backyard years ago. The operator asked for more information, but I hung up quickly before they could trace the call. Later, I found out through some searching that the tip was assigned to a detective named Andre Hartman. Nothing seemed to happen right away, though, and I started wondering if they even took it seriously. Mr. Freeman started calling me repeatedly over the next few days, leaving voicemails that sounded more and more panicked. He kept saying he needed to talk to me privately about what happened, and begged me to call him back. I didn't answer any of his calls, but saved all the messages like Isabelle had suggested doing for evidence. At work, I could barely focus on my marketing presentations, and kept checking my phone for news about the Freeman house. Isabelle noticed I was distracted, and kept looking at my phone every few minutes during meetings. She offered to drive by the house during lunch to see if there was any police activity happening. When she came back, she reported that everything looked completely normal with no police cars or investigators anywhere. This made me wonder if my tip was ignored or if they needed more concrete information to get a search warrant. I started researching online what kind of evidence police would need to search private property for a body. That evening, when Calin came home from work, she dropped her bag by the door and collapsed on the couch next to me. She started talking about how worried she was about her dad because he'd been drinking way more than usual lately. She said he'd gone through 3 bottles of wine just this week and kept jumping every time the phone rang like he was scared of something. I kept my face neutral while she described how he'd been locking himself in his study for hours, and she could hear him pacing back and forth in there. She grabbed my hand and asked if I'd noticed anything weird when we talked at dinner the other night. My stomach twisted, but I just said he seemed fine to me and maybe work was stressing him out. She nodded but didn't look convinced and said she'd never seen him this jumpy before. After she went to take a shower, I opened my laptop and started searching for missing persons cases from 30 years ago in the area. I typed different combinations of keywords trying to find anything that matched what Mr. Freeman had told me about his old boyfriend. On the 3rd page of search results, I found an old newspaper article about a medical student named James who disappeared without a trace. The article said he was last seen leaving a bar near where the Freemans now lived, and the timeline matched perfectly with when Mr. Freeman would have been in college. James had been 23 years old with dark hair and was studying to become a surgeon before he vanished one night in October. His family had searched for months and put up reward posters, but nobody ever found any trace of him. The article included a grainy black and white photo, and I could see why Mr. Freeman might think I looked like him. I saved the article to my computer and made notes about all the details, including dates and locations. The guilt of keeping this from Calin was eating me alive, so when she came out of the shower, I told her we needed to talk. I sat her down and said her father had told me something concerning when we were alone, but I couldn't give her all the details yet. Her face immediately changed and she pulled her hand away from mine. She said I was making things up because I didn't like her mother and was trying to cause problems in her family. I tried to explain that this was serious and had nothing to do with her mother, but she wasn't listening anymore. She stood up and started pacing around the apartment, saying she couldn't believe I would stoop this low. She accused me of being so insecure about my background that I was trying to sabotage her relationship with her parents. Her voice got louder as she said I was jealous of their success and wanted to bring them down to my level. I wanted so badly to tell her the whole truth about the kiss and the body, but I knew it would destroy her entire world. She kept yelling about how I'd never accepted her family, and now I was making up stories to turn her against them. The fight lasted over an hour with her defending her parents and me trying to convince her something was really wrong without revealing what I knew. She finally grabbed her overnight bag and said she was going to stay at her friend's place because she couldn't even look at me right now. After she slammed the door, I sat on the couch feeling sick about everything that was happening. The next morning, my phone rang while I was making coffee, and the screen showed a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a man's voice said he was Detective Andre Hartman and he'd received a tip about the Freeman property. My heart started racing as he asked if I knew anything about it since records showed I'd been to the house recently. I panicked and denied making any call, but he said he'd still like to meet with me unofficially to discuss the situation. He suggested we meet at a park across town in an hour and said it would just be a friendly conversation. I agreed, even though my hands were shaking as I hung up the phone. I drove to the park and found him sitting on a bench near the playground, wearing regular clothes instead of a uniform. He was a tall black man in his 40s with gray starting to show in his hair. He shook my hand and thanked me for coming, then got right to the point about the tip they'd received. He said someone had called about possible human remains at the Freeman property, but they couldn't do anything without probable cause or consent from the owners. I mentioned that Mr. Freeman had been acting really strange lately and seemed scared of something. The detective's eyes got more interested, and he asked me to describe what I'd noticed about his behavior. I told him about the drinking and the jumpiness without mentioning the kiss or confession. He nodded and pulled out a business card with his direct number on it. He said to call him if I remembered anything else that might help them get enough evidence for a warrant. I took the card and promised to think about it even though I already knew, so much more than I was saying. A few days later, I was at the grocery store picking up milk when someone tapped me on the shoulder. I turned around to see an elderly man with thick glasses who said his name was Dale Meade. He said he was the Freeman's neighbor and remembered seeing me at their dinner party a while back. He looked around like he was checking if anyone was listening, then said he wanted to talk to me about some strange things he'd seen at their house over the years. We moved to a quiet corner by the frozen foods, and he started telling me about a night decades ago that he'd never forgotten. He said he'd been having trouble sleeping and was sitting by his bedroom window around 3 in the morning when he heard shouting from the Freeman's backyard. He couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like a bad argument between multiple people. Then he heard what sounded like digging that went on for over an hour in the dark. He said he'd always wondered what they were burying out there, but never felt it was his place to report it. His wife had told him to mind his own business, but the memory had stuck with him all these years. I asked if he'd be willing to tell the story to the police, and his face got nervous. After some convincing, I got him to agree to meet with Detective Hartman and give an official statement about what he'd witnessed. We exchanged phone numbers, and I called the detective as soon as I got to my car. Detective Hartman met with Dale the next day and took his statement, but called me afterward to say it still wasn't enough. He said the testimony helped establish suspicious activity, but they needed more concrete evidence to get a judge to sign a warrant. He asked me to keep thinking about anything else that might help their case. I was sitting at my desk at work the next Monday, trying to focus on a marketing presentation, when the receptionist called to say I had a visitor. I walked out to the lobby and felt my blood run cold when I saw Mrs. Freeman standing there in an expensive suit. She said she wanted to discuss my career trajectory and how it affected her daughter's future. Her smile was sharp as she suggested we talk in private, and I had no choice but to lead her to a conference room. Once the door closed, her whole demeanor changed, and she dropped the fake concern about my career. She said she knew I was stirring up trouble and causing problems for her family. Her voice stayed calm, but her eyes were cold as she explained that she had connections everywhere in this city. She said one phone call from her could end my career and make sure I never worked in marketing again. The real message was crystal clear that she wanted me gone from Calin's life and away from her family. I pulled out my phone and pretended to open a notes app while actually hitting record, nodding along as she kept talking about how one word from her could destroy my entire future. She leaned back in her chair and started naming specific people she knew at major companies in town, explaining how she'd helped them get their positions and how they owed her favors. Her voice stayed calm and controlled as she described how easy it would be to spread word that I was unstable, unreliable, maybe even dangerous to have around young female employees. My phone sat on the table between us, screen down, recording every threat while I pretended to type career advice into my notes. She went on for another 10 minutes about how she'd already talked to some friends about her concerns regarding me, how worried she was about her daughter's safety with someone so clearly beneath their social class. When she finally stood to leave, she smoothed her skirt and smiled that cold smile again, saying she hoped I'd make the right choice for everyone involved. I waited until she left the building before stopping the recording and saving multiple copies to different cloud services. My hands shook as I texted Isabelle about what just happened, and she immediately came to find me in the conference room. That night, I was home making dinner when someone knocked on my apartment door around 8:30. Through the peephole, I saw Mr. Freeman standing in the hallway, his tie loose and his hair messy like he'd been running his hands through it. He looked terrible, his face pale and his eyes darting around the hallway like he expected someone to jump out at him. I opened the door and he pushed past me without waiting for an invitation, his whole body shaking as he begged me to stop whatever I was doing. He said Margaret had been acting strange all day, making phone calls in her study with the door locked, and he'd heard my name mentioned several times. His words came out in a rush as he paced around my small living room, saying she'd been drinking more than usual and had started asking him strange questions about our conversation on the patio. He kept pulling at his collar and sleeves, adjusting them constantly while he talked. That's when I noticed the edge of a dark mark on his wrist that he quickly covered with his sleeve. When he turned to look out my window, I saw another bruise peeking out from under his collar on the side of his neck. The marks looked fresh, purple and yellow around the edges, and when I asked if Margaret hurt him, his whole body went rigid. He tried to deny it at first, but then his face crumpled and he sank onto my couch, sobbing so hard his shoulders shook. Between gasps for air, he admitted she'd been hitting him for years, usually where the bruises wouldn't show, but lately she'd been getting careless. He pulled up his sleeves to show me more marks, finger-shaped bruises on both wrists, and what looked like scratches on his forearms. His voice broke as he told me about James, how they'd met in college and fallen in love before anyone even talked about being gay openly. James had been in medical school, brilliant and funny and everything Mr. Freeman had ever wanted, and they'd been planning a future together even though they knew it would be hard. Then Margaret found them together one night when she came to his apartment unexpectedly, and she went crazy, screaming about how he'd humiliated her and destroyed her reputation. The confrontation moved to the backyard where she grabbed a shovel from the garden shed and hit James in the head before Mr. Freeman could stop her. He described the sound it made, the way James fell, how the blood looked black in the darkness. Margaret had stood there with the shovel in her hands, completely calm suddenly, and told him they were going to bury the body together, or she'd tell everyone he was gay and had attacked James himself. She said she had witnesses who would swear they'd seen him arguing with James earlier that week, that no one would believe him over her. So he helped dig the hole under the hydrangeas while she stood guard, and they wrapped James in plastic sheeting from the garage. For 30 years, she'd held it over his head, reminding him constantly that she owned him, that one word from her would destroy everything. Every time he thought about leaving or standing up to her, she'd mention the garden, mention James, mention how easy it would be to make him disappear too. The bruises had started a few years into their marriage, when he'd tried to refuse one of her social events, and they'd gotten worse over time. When I told him I'd already contacted the police about the body, his face went white and he jumped up from the couch like I'd hit him. He started hyperventilating, saying Margaret had friends everywhere, that she'd know within hours if the police started investigating, that we were both dead if she found out. He backed toward my door, shaking his head and repeating that I didn't understand what she was capable of, that she'd killed before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again. Before I could grab him or calm him down, he yanked open my door and ran down the hallway toward the stairs. I heard his footsteps echoing in the stairwell as he fled, leaving me standing in my doorway trying to process everything he'd just told me. About an hour later, Calin got home from her book club, taking one look at my face and immediately demanding to know what was wrong. I sat her down on the couch and told her everything, starting with her father's kiss on the patio and ending with him running out of our apartment minutes ago. Her face went through so many emotions as I talked, confusion turning to disbelief, turning to anger. When I finished, she stood up slowly, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She called me a liar, said I was making up 6 stories about her family because I couldn't handle her mother's criticism. The slap came so fast I didn't see it coming, her palm connecting with my cheek hard enough to snap my head to the side. She grabbed her purse and keys, saying she was going to her parents' house to prove I was lying, and nothing I said could stop her from storming out. I immediately called Isabelle, who came over within 20 minutes with her laptop and camera. We spent the next 2 hours documenting everything, taking screenshots of the recording app showing timestamps, photographing my cheek where Calin had hit me, and organizing all the voicemails from Mr. Freeman into a folder. Isabelle thought we needed to get Mr. Freeman somewhere safe before his wife hurt him worse, or maybe even killed him to keep him quiet. We were still working on documentation when my phone rang, Detective Hartman's name showing on the screen. He said Calin had shown up at the police station about an hour ago, crying and accusing me of harassment and making false reports about her family. He needed me to come in for official questioning about the situation, and while his voice was professional, he also sounded interested in hearing my side. Isabelle drove me to the station since my hands were still shaking, and we walked in together around midnight. Detective Hartman met us in the lobby and led us to an interview room that smelled like old coffee and cleaning products. He turned on a recording device and read me some kind of official statement about the interview being voluntary, then asked me to explain the situation from my perspective. I pulled out my phone and played the recording of Mrs. Freeman threatening my career, watching his eyebrows rise as her voice filled the small room. Then I showed him the timestamps from all of Mr. Freeman's calls, the photos Isabelle had taken of everything, and finally told him about Mr. Freeman's confession just hours earlier. Detective Hartman took notes the entire time, occasionally asking for clarification about dates or times. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said this was definitely enough to open a formal investigation into both the threats and the possible murder. He was starting to explain the next steps when my phone buzzed with a text from Mr. Freeman. The message said Margaret knew everything, and he was scared for his life. A second text came through immediately with a photo that made my stomach turn. Fresh bruises covered his ribs in dark purple and yellow patches that looked really painful. I showed the phone to Detective Hartman, who grabbed it and stared at the screen for several seconds before jumping up from his chair. He called for backup while rushing toward the door, telling us to stay at the station for our safety. Isabelle and I sat in that small room for what felt like hours, but was probably only 40 minutes. The coffee machine down the hall kept making these loud, grinding noises every few minutes. Finally, Detective Hartman called to update us on what they found at the Freeman house. The officers discovered Mr. Freeman locked in the garage with injuries all over his body that matched the photo he sent me. Margaret was standing in the kitchen when they arrived, calmly drinking tea and claiming her husband had fallen down the stairs earlier that evening. The paramedics took Mr. Freeman to the hospital while the police arrested Margaret for assault, despite her protests about this being a misunderstanding. With Margaret finally in custody at the station, Mr. Freeman felt safe enough to tell the police everything about what happened to James 30 years ago. Detective Hartman said Mr. Freeman sat in his hospital bed, drawing a detailed map of their backyard on a piece of paper. He marked the exact spot under the oldest hydrangea bush where they had buried the body that night. The map showed measurements from the back door and the fence line to help investigators find the right location. Mr. Freeman also described how Margaret had wrapped James in plastic sheeting from their garage before making him help carry the body outside. My phone rang while I was still processing all this information, and Calin's name appeared on the screen. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her words at first. She kept saying she was sorry for not believing me and couldn't believe what her mother had done to both James and her father. She was at the hospital with her dad, trying to process that her entire family life had been built on violence and lies and murder. Her voice broke when she asked if I could forgive her for slapping me and calling me a liar. I told her we could talk about everything later and that she should focus on being there for her father right now. The next morning, police got a warrant to excavate the Freemans' backyard based on Mr. Freeman's testimony and all the evidence we had collected. I drove past their street on my way to work and saw news vans already starting to appear as word spread about the investigation. By lunchtime, there were reporters from 3 different stations set up on the sidewalk. Dale called me that afternoon to say the police had started digging and asked if I wanted to watch from his house since he had a clear view of the Freemans' backyard. I left work early and met Isabelle at Dale's place where we stood at his kitchen window, watching investigators carefully dig around the hydrangeas. They worked slowly and methodically, sifting through each shovel of dirt like they were looking for something fragile. After 3 hours of digging, one of the investigators raised their hand and called the others over to look at something. We watched them carefully brush dirt away from what looked like old plastic wrapped around something large. The medical examiner arrived within 20 minutes and confirmed the remains appeared to be several decades old based on the condition of the plastic and the soil layers. They spent another 2 hours carefully removing the entire bundle from the ground while photographers documented every step of the process. Dale made us sandwiches while we waited, but none of us could really eat anything. 2 days later, Detective Hartman called to tell me the DNA testing had confirmed the remains belonged to James, the missing medical student from 30 years ago. His family had been notified after 3 decades of not knowing what happened to their son and brother. Detective Hartman said Mr. Freeman's cooperation was the only reason they could finally solve this cold case that had haunted James's family for so long. The medical examiner found evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull that matched Mr. Freeman's description of how Margaret had hit James with the shovel. Within a week, Margaret was formally charged with murder, while Mr. Freeman faced lesser charges for helping conceal the crime. His lawyer argued successfully that he had been coerced through decades of domestic violence and threats. The case became front-page news in our city, with Margaret's photo plastered across every newspaper and website. Even her rich society friends started distancing themselves from her once the evidence became public. Calin couldn't stand being in her childhood home after learning what had happened there, so she moved in with me temporarily while we figured out next steps. We started going to couples therapy twice a week to work through all the trauma and betrayal she was experiencing. The therapist helped us talk about the slap and the accusations and how to rebuild trust after everything that happened. Calin had nightmares most nights about finding bodies in the garden or her mother coming after us with a shovel. Meanwhile, Mr. Freeman entered a treatment program for domestic violence survivors with help from an advocate named Sunita, who specialized in male victims. She had worked with men who had been abused by their partners for years and understood the unique challenges they faced. Mr. Freeman finally started talking about the decades of abuse he had suffered in silence, too ashamed to tell anyone that his wife hit him and controlled every aspect of his life. The next Monday at work, my boss pulled me into his office after the story hit the local news, and I thought I was about to get fired for bringing bad publicity to the company. Instead, he shook my hand and told me he was proud of me for standing up to that family, despite the personal risk. The whole marketing team had seen the news coverage, and Isabelle kept joking that I should add Crime Solver to my business cards. Over the next few weeks, Margaret's lawyer tried every trick to make me look bad in court, claiming I had made up evidence because her daughter wouldn't marry me. He brought up my middle-class background and suggested I was jealous of their wealth and trying to destroy their family out of spite. But when the prosecutor played the recording of Margaret threatening me at my office, the whole courtroom went silent. Then they brought up Mr. Freeman to testify about the decades of abuse and how Margaret had forced him to help bury James's body. Her fancy lawyer couldn't explain away the DNA evidence or the recorded threats or the bruises in the photos. Even Margaret's rich society friends who used to come to her garden parties stopped showing up to support her in court. 3 months into all the legal stuff, Calin and I had somehow gotten stronger instead of falling apart like everyone expected. She moved in with me permanently, and we went to therapy twice a week to work through everything. One night she told me she was proud of me for having the courage to expose the truth when it would have been easier to just walk away. She said most guys would have run after that first dinner with her mom, but I stayed and fought for what was right. Around that same time, I got a letter from Mr. Freeman thanking me for saving his life, even though it meant losing everything he'd known. He wrote that facing possible prison time was still better than living another day under Margaret's control. He was finally getting real therapy to deal with being gay and all the trauma from hiding it for 30 years. The therapist was helping him understand that what Margaret did to him was abuse, and not his fault. A month later, James's family held a proper funeral after getting his remains back from the medical examiner. The judge allowed Mr. Freeman to attend with a police escort since he'd been cooperating with the investigation. I watched from across the cemetery as he broke down sobbing, while James's elderly mother hugged him and said she forgave him. After 30 years of not knowing what happened to their son, they finally had closure. The Freeman house went up for sale since neither Calin nor her father could stand to go back there knowing what happened in that garden. The real estate agent had to disclose that human remains were found on the property, which made it hard to sell. Eventually, a young couple bought it for way under market value and planned to completely tear out the garden and start fresh. Calin decided the sale money should go to James's family and to organizations that help domestic violence victims. The trial for Margaret's murder charge took 6 months to finish with all the evidence and testimony. When the jury came back with a guilty verdict for first-degree murder, she didn't even react. Throughout the whole trial, she kept insisting she was protecting her family's reputation and that James was trying to corrupt her husband. Even when the judge sentenced her to life in prison without parole, she held her head high and acted like she was better than everyone in that courtroom. Her lawyer filed an appeal, but everyone knew it wouldn't go anywhere with all the evidence against her. Mr. Freeman's sentencing happened 2 weeks later, and his lawyer argued successfully that he was a victim of decades of domestic violence and coercion. The judge reviewed all the medical records of his injuries over the years and the therapist's reports about his trauma. Instead of prison time, Mr. Freeman got 5 years of probation and 300 hours of community service. He cried with relief when he heard the sentence and immediately started looking for a small apartment where he could finally live as himself. After everything wrapped up legally, Detective Hartman called me to his office and shook my hand, saying I'd shown more courage than most people would in my situation. He said my persistence in pursuing the truth despite personal danger would help other domestic violence victims come forward. He kept my contact information in case they ever needed a civilian consultant who wasn't afraid to dig for the truth. The detective also mentioned that this case had changed how they looked at domestic violence with male victims. Meanwhile, Calin had been working with lawyers to set up a non-profit foundation using her inheritance money. She wanted to create something good from all the pain her family had caused. The foundation would help LGBTQ kids whose families rejected them, providing housing and counseling and legal help. She named it after James and said it was a way to honor both his memory and her father's hidden truth. She spent every day at the foundation office, interviewing staff and setting up programs, finally finding a purpose after learning her whole life had been built on lies. 6 months after the trial ended, Mr. Freeman called to tell me he'd met someone at the support group and wanted us to meet him. We drove to a quiet restaurant downtown where Mr. Freeman sat next to a man with gray hair and kind eyes who kept touching his shoulder gently. They held hands on the table while Mr. Freeman introduced him as Robert, a retired teacher who understood what it was like to hide for decades. Robert told us how he'd been married to a woman for 20 years before finally coming out at 50, and now he was helping Mr. Freeman learn to be himself. Watching Mr. Freeman actually smile and laugh felt strange after seeing him so broken for so long. He ordered wine without his hands shaking and talked about joining a book club with Robert and going to movies together. When we left the restaurant, he hugged me tight and whispered thanks for giving him this chance at real happiness. The next spring, Calin and I decided to get engaged without any big production or fancy plans. We invited just our closest friends to my apartment, where I got down on one knee in the living room while Isabelle filmed it on her phone. Calin said yes immediately, and everyone cheered while we opened champagne and ordered pizza to celebrate. Her dad showed up an hour later with Robert, both of them crying happy tears when they saw the ring. We spent the rest of the night planning a small wedding that would be nothing like the huge society event her mother would have demanded. Dale started inviting us over for tea every Sunday afternoon at his house next door to where the Freemans used to live. He'd pull out old photo albums showing the neighborhood before Margaret moved in and poisoned everything with her hate. He told us stories about block parties and kids playing in the streets before everyone became afraid of the Freeman house. One afternoon, he mentioned how he'd always suspected something was wrong, but never had the courage to speak up until I came along. He said watching the new family fix up the garden where James was buried gave him hope that dark places could become bright again. When it came time to plan the wedding, Mr. Freeman and Robert threw themselves into helping us with everything. They went cake tasting with us and helped pick flowers and argued about table arrangements like an old married couple. Mr. Freeman teared up when Calin asked if he'd walk her down the aisle despite everything that happened. He said it would be the proudest moment of his life to give her away to someone who actually deserved her. Robert helped him pick out a new suit since all his old ones reminded him of Margaret. The wedding day came on a perfect Saturday in May at a small garden venue that had nothing but happy memories. My parents flew in from Ohio, and my dad actually got along great with Mr. Freeman, talking about home repairs and fishing. My mom helped Calin with her dress while Isabelle ran around as maid of honor making sure everything stayed on schedule. James's elderly mother sent a huge arrangement of white roses with a card saying she was happy something beautiful came from all the pain. During the ceremony, Mr. Freeman's voice cracked when he gave Calin away, but he made it through without breaking down. We kept everything simple with just 50 guests who actually cared about us, not the 300 strangers Margaret would have invited to impress. 2 years after that horrible first dinner at the Freeman house, I sat in my new office looking at the sign for my marketing firm on the door. I'd gotten promoted twice at my old job before leaving to start my own company, with 3 major clients already signed. Calin worked full-time running her foundation, which had already helped dozens of kids escape from families who rejected them. We bought a small house in a different neighborhood where nobody knew our story, and we could just be normal. Mr. Freeman visited every week with Robert, and they'd started fostering a gay teenager who'd been kicked out by his parents. Watching Mr. Freeman help that kid with homework and teach him it was okay to be himself showed how much he'd healed. He spoke at domestic violence support groups twice a month, telling his story to help other men trapped in abusive marriages. He said every person he helped escape made his own suffering mean something, instead of just being wasted years. Robert supported him through the hard nights when memories of Margaret still haunted him. Looking back now at everything that happened since that kiss on the patio, I realized how many lives changed because Mr. Freeman finally told the truth. 3 people got free from Margaret's toxic control and found real happiness for the first time. James's family got closure after 30 years of not knowing what happened to their son. Dale got to see his neighborhood heal from the darkness the Freemans brought to it. Even my relationship with Calin grew stronger because we faced the worst together and came out the other side. The truth really did set everyone free, even though it hurt like hell getting there. That's it for this one. Nothing fancy, just the way it happened. Appreciate you being here. See you next time if you're around.